Beautiful butterflies, grab your coffee, or let's be real, your survival juice, because today's conversation is one you do not want to miss. If you have ever sat in church feeling invisible, silenced, or like you were somehow responsible for keeping the peace at the expense of your own well-being, then buckle up. We're about to go there. Today, I have the privilege of sitting down with a man who is not afraid to call out the toxic patterns that keep women oppressed in Christian spaces. Dr. Andrew Bauman is a licensed mental health counselor, an author, and the founder of the Christian Counseling Center for Sexual Health and Trauma. His work is raw, honest, and, dare I say, refreshingly unafraid to challenge the status quo. Andrew has written several powerful books, but today we're diving into his latest, Safe Church: How to Guard Against Sexism and Abuse in Christian Communities. Now, let's just pause for a second and acknowledge something. The idea of a safe church should be redundant, right? And yet, here we are. Many of you listening know what it's like to walk into a church and feel anything but safe. Whether it's the crushing weight of purity culture, the twisting of submission into something unrecognizable, or the way abuse is ignored, minimized, or even spiritualized. Safe Church is a lifeline for those of us who have been gaslit into believing that advocating for our dignity somehow makes us the problem. In this book, Andrew doesn't just expose the sickness, he also gives us tools for healing. He is calling men, especially church leaders, to do the hard inner work of uprooting misogyny, and he's equipping women with language and validation for what we've known deep down all along. Jesus was never about power hoarding or control. So if you've ever been told to forgive and forget while your abuser was given a leadership role, or if you've been made to feel like biblical womanhood means being small and silent, you need to hear this conversation. Dr. Bauman, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for your courage, your honesty, and for refusing to play nice with bad theology.
Thank you. That was a wonderful introduction. I need to keep that recording in my back pocket and just listen to it for my self-esteem. Thank you. It's glad to be here.
Okay, so let's start with the big question. What made you sit down and say, yep, I need to write this book?
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if there was a particular moment, maybe a breaking point, or just years of watching church leaders fumble the ball on safety and accountability. And also, why do you think this message is hitting so close to home for so many people right now?
Well, to answer this question, I mean, it's kind of like a three-parter, so I'll try to keep it short. But basically, it starts in my origin story of my father was a pastor and also a secret sex addict, and cheated on my mom for 20-something years while he was a vice president of a Christian college and a prominent evangelical leader. This is in the 80s. And so I'm 8 years old and my whole family blows up. My mom goes numb, and then in a sense, to survive, basically somebody found out who he was and then threatened to tell the news if he didn't pay them tons of money. So he stole tons of money. It's a dark, deep path, and we won't go all into that. But that was kind of my origin story.
Okay.
Right. So I'm 8 years old, and the church, in a sense, becomes a safe place. My mom takes 3 kids by herself and moves to North Carolina where her parents are retired. And we're at church every time the doors are open. And so that was kind of my origin. Nobody talked about what was my inner world. Nobody talked what was going on. My mom still felt, I remember an older woman kind of wagging their finger, your kids need a father. And my mom still felt so protective of my father's reputation to try to make sure nobody knew. And so that was kind of what I was marinating in.
Yeah.
Right. And then so fast forward 20 years later, graduate Bible and religion degree, and I become a pastor. And I'm also at this point 13 years addicted to pornography.
Mm.
And so I have this kind of war going on inside of me. What I'm learning through objectifying women on the internet, and then it's mixing with this degrading view of women in oppressive theology in the Southern Baptist Church that I worked in, and it kind of fit. It kind of worked. It was like in a sense I was split off and I wasn't authentic, but yet I was good at my job, and yet as more honest I became, realizing that I was a fraud and realizing like something needs to change, I began to, only after a year and a half of being a pastor, I was like, oh, I think I need to become a therapist. I think I need to become more honest with my life. I need to become, and so that was kind of the beginning of me deconstructing my faith, me beginning to tell the truth of my story, both my own origin story, but also my own addiction, and facing my deep pain, facing my deepest heartache, and ultimately discovering the depth of my purpose. And so that was kind of the beginning to set me on this path to advocacy. And so that's the kind of the backstory. But then the other backstory is 2018. I'm reading a study called The Elephant in the Valley about sexism in Silicon Valley, which is a male-dominated, environment in tech. And I was like, I'm wondering, what about another male-dominated space, as 87% of churches are led by men? I wonder what their experience, of sexism and abuse are. So that started the project over 5 years ago, interviewing women in depth about their experience, also a survey of over 2,800 women who worked in the church, and beginning to gather data about their experience of sexism and abuse.
Wow. Okay. So let's talk about sexism and abuse. These are two things that should have no place in a
Yeah.
Jesus-centered community, but they do. So what are
Yes.
the most common ways that these issues show up in church settings? And for the pastors and leaders out there who think, "Oh no, it's not in my church," what should they be paying
Mhm.
attention to?
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about sexism, we're basically just talking about prejudice, discrimination, and stereotyping because of someone's sex. There's multiple different types of sexism. We won't get into that. So that's what sexism is. And abuse, obviously, there's all sorts of types: emotional, psychological, sexual, financial, spiritual. But the simplest definition of abuse is a power over rather than a power shared,
Mm.
right? And so what we're seeing from the research of, over 82% of women believe sexism played a role in their own church, which is wild.
Yeah.
Over 2,800 women. And these aren't just random women off the street that went to church. These are women that 16% of them worked in the church over 25 years.
Wow.
25% worked in the church over 16 years. So these are women that have been on the front lines of ministry for decades and decades, and
Yeah.
it's their experience of it. And so they're sharing, and so for me, I wanted to say, well, hey, I was a part of the problem. I was a pastor who worked with all of his buddies and had a great time and thought we were doing, the Lord's work. But then just kind of the women in the children's ministry and making us sandwiches was kind of fine. That was normal because I was doing the important work of God.
Right.
And what I didn't realize what I was doing was literally cutting off a part of the image, like an image, part of God. I'm literally silencing part of God. And then the way I interpreted scripture, the way, like, in a sense, it all worked together. And sadly, that's still in many circles, that's the norm, is that women are less than, but they would never say it out loud.
Yeah.
Right. And so the stories that I heard and the stories that make up the book are just horrific, one after another. Some of the big stats that came out of the book: 62% wouldn't be surprised if they heard a sexist joke, right? Women in the kitchen, women leaders, women drivers. And, I grew up hearing that stuff all the time.
Yeah.
35% said that they've reported some type of sexual harassment or some form of sexual misconduct, or they answered it was complicated, right? In ministry. So that's over one in three women. 77.9% said that their opportunities in ministries were limited because of their gender as far as their own career paths. And then for all these statistics, we have women's stories, because I believe stories are powerful, and the stories are horrific and incredibly difficult to hear. And me as a man, may be surprised at some of them, and yet so many of the women readers are like, "Yes, this happened to me. This
Yeah.
happened to me. This happened to me. Oh, this is my experience." It's not an anomaly. It's
Yeah.
actually the norm.
Yes. Yes. And my guess is that if you were to interview the same amount of men in ministry and churches, that the numbers would be flipped. Most of
Yes,
them would say, "No, there's not sexism in the church. We honor our women. We uplift them
exactly.
and serve them and whatever."
Seems like a follow-up book we need to write.
Yes,
Well,
seriously.
let's go.
Seriously,
I
that's a
know.
good idea.
Sure.
Uh, um, well, and that might also drum up some interest among men too in a book like that. I feel like
Mhm.
men don't care as long as the system is working for them. What do they
Bingo.
care, right?
Bingo,
Yeah.
bingo, and the biggest fear, what I'm realizing, right, is men begin to if we begin to study power dynamics and we actually give up power, I think the fear is that we're going to treat women. I mean, we're women are going to treat us the way we've treated women.
Yeah.
It's like, wait a minute, no, that's not what I'm advocating for. I
Yeah.
don't want anybody to be the oppressor group.
Exactly.
I'm advocating for shared power
Exactly.
because I believe together we bear the image of God, and together we can actually represent God more fully.
Yes. And I think if you interviewed Christian women who love the Lord and are doing things like serving in the
Mhm.
church, they would be 100% about that.
Yes,
That
exactly.
is the what it's where that's where we're supposed to head. All right. So you talk a lot about creating a safe church. Now, I know a lot of churches will say they're safe, but when push comes to shove, they're more concerned about protecting their reputation
Ooh.
than their people. So what are the actual tangible things that a church needs to do to be genuinely safe, not just in theory, but in practice?
Yes. That's a great question, and I'm going to answer your question, but I want to start with one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Diane Lamberg, and when she talks about uh, to understand single-handedly, you can't change an entire system. You are not called to do so. Yet we are to speak truth about our systems,
Hmm.
right? She goes on to say this is difficult to do and sometimes risky. Ask Martin Luther King Jr., ask Martin Luther himself, ask those in the Me Too movement. When systems change is often little by little and usually at a great cost. When you feel overwhelmed, remember this: people are sacred, created the image of God. Systems are not.
Amen.
They are only worth the people in them and the people they serve. And people are to be treated, whether one or many, the way Jesus Christ treated people. I just
Yeah.
love that quote. So
Yes, that's awesome.
our systems are not image bearers of God,
Yeah.
right? And because I'm talking out about a system, it doesn't mean I'm against it. It actually means I'm for it.
Right.
I actually want the system to do better because the church is so important to me, was so important to my mom. And there's such goodness there, such community there. I wouldn't speak out against it or speak out against the harms and the abuses of it unless I cared about it. Right.
Yes.
And so how do people actually, there's all sorts of things. What I normally say, number one, as how do churches become safer, is the leadership people have to do their own work, right? They have to, in a sense, do their own internal healing. You can't lead others where you have not gone yourself.
Yeah.
So if you have, a hidden addiction to pornography, or you have, this kind of inner, this misogyny that's deep down, you haven't done that work, it's going to come out in your leadership. You're going to be preaching a lot about modesty, right? You're going to be projecting your shame because I don't want to deal with my shame. I'm going to project it outward, and then I'm going to put it on the victims of harm, right? Or I'm going to leave the door open when I meet with women because I'm going to feel good about myself of look how much I honor women.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't want her just to jump my bones, and when really what's actually happening, she doesn't want to jump your bones at all. You don't trust your own self sexually because you're not a sexually healthy man
Yes.
and you're the dangerous one. Will you be more honest with that?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there needs to be more like the ability to have open conversations about it so that There isn't all of this secrecy and shame about it.
Right. Well, that's the setup, right? That's the setup of the CEO model of what we've developed with church. So many, and again, I work with men from all over the world and people in ministry. And if they're honest, they lose their jobs, right? And they're
Yeah.
like, "Oh, I can't feed my kids. I've been on the mission field for 20 years. I don't have any other skills." And, it's like we're setting up ministry leaders. And so many times they don't feel like they can be honest, which again isn't the answer to continue to lie, but it's also such a crappy setup that
Yeah.
they can't be human, and they think that's somehow good leadership. And I'd argue the complete opposite. Full authenticity is what safe leadership and good leadership is. But then out of that, then you can begin to develop church policies and implement safeguards. Um, One thing that the women said over and over is, I just wanted representation. I just want more
Yeah.
women at the table. I just want, I don't want to be alone in this. And so many times, they would bring infidelity, or they'd bring, porn use, and it was minimized. And it was, so many times. And I remember one story in particular from a woman named Jackie. We changed all people's names so they could stay
Hmm.
anonymous, but Jackie shared when she was abused by someone in church leadership. This was a man in his 40s, and she was a late teenager, 18 years old. And she brought it to the pastor, and he kept calling it sex, and then
Okay.
blamed her for being a seductress. Um, and then finally, at one point in one of the meetings, the pastor's wife was a part of the meeting, and he was calling it sex. And then she interrupted and said, "I believe that's called rape."
Good
And
for
just like
her.
one woman. And then Jackie was just shared how much that meant to her, that finally another woman's in the room and
Yes.
can name it for what it is,
Yes.
right? And so instead of being blamed nonstop for breaking up this guy's family when he was the perpetrator.
Right. Right. I have a story like that in my background when I was in high school too. A girl, one of the girls in my youth group was having what notice how I even just go
Uh-oh,
there. Isn't
Freudian
that
slip.
interesting? That's the
Yes,
story in my
right.
head. That's the story that we were told. It's a story that I just believed my whole life.
Yes.
She supposedly, had an affair. She was probably 17 years old and he
Ugh.
was in his early 30s. And
Yes.
I remember my mom, like she was coming down on this girl and her family for weaseling her way in. And
Gross.
she didn't let the youth pastor off the hook either, but she made it seem like it was both of their equally their issue,
Mutual.
right? I think
Yeah.
that's why my brain goes to had an affair.
And
So,
if you want to know about sexual abuse, all you have to do is look at the power dynamic. Who holds the power?
right,
Who holds
right.
the power?
Yep.
Oh, he's been a leader. Oh, he's in spiritual authority. Like sexual abuse.
Yes.
Like that is
Yes.
not an equal relationship where both parties have equal responsibility. Now
Exactly.
that would be a different story if they were, both adults and made a choice to mutually betray their families and lie. But that's not what that story is.
Right. I think even when girls, just because they turn 18 doesn't mean that there's no power dynamic
Exactly.
there, or they're in their early 20s. There's still a power dynamic there. Um,
Exactly.
yeah, and I want to just draw attention to what I just did there with my little slip. I think it's really important for all of us to be aware that we have that ingrained misogyny inside of us, even if
Yes.
we are a female who
Yes.
advocates and fights against it, like I would consider myself to be. That is still part of my early programming, and it's
Yes.
always going to be there. It's something
Yes.
that I have to ongoing remind myself and fight against, not fight against, but be aware that it's in there so that I can catch myself when I
Ex-
see that bubbling up inside of me naturally. I don't think it's
Exactly.
anything to be ashamed of because there's nothing we can do about our early programming, but it's
Yes.
definitely something to call out when we see it in ourselves for sure.
And I just want to encourage also kindness, that you have been marinating in that mindset for what, 40 years, 30
Yeah,
years? Like you've
50.
been in that. Yeah, you were in that forever. And so it's in you.
Yeah,
Like it's in you. And
exactly.
you can be kind to say, yeah, that's where I come from. And I still have to wrestle with some of those beliefs that I've been untangling you're unlearning and you're relearning something more healthy.
That's right. That's right. And hopefully we'll be doing that the rest of my life. All right, let's talk about the age-old tension between grace versus accountability. Some churches will hand out grace like free candy to offenders, while survivors are told to forgive and move on. So how do we get this balance right and ensure that grace never comes at the expense of justice?
Yes, that's a great question. It reminds me of Kristen from our study, and she shared this direct quote: "After my husband was abusive and porn addicted, I was told to forgive, that my anger would cause him to do porn even more, that I shouldn't get angry. Since I was a Christian for longer than he was, I should set a better example."
Yeah, I've heard that
Right?
one.
Like, exactly. I mean, they told her not even to be angry,
Wow.
right? Basically, your humanity. Don't be human,
Yeah.
Kristen. Don't be human. Because what I say is, not only should she be angry, right? She should feel betrayed. She should feel rage, heartache, grief, right? Like the opposite. Rather than focusing on the abuser, they weaponized forgiveness, right? They called for
Yeah.
cheap grace, all right?
Yeah.
Basically, you need to forgive and move on, because that's the number one. When people are practicing weaponizing forgiveness, they just want to move quickly,
Yep.
because in a sense they get a spiritual point, right? We get the win here, because we got forgiveness, rather than actually learning to sit with the harm, to sit with the abuse. They want to spiritually bypass
Mhm.
and not actually enter into it. And that's weaponizing forgiveness. That's cheap grace, and it's horrific. And so many women that I talk to will face this, right? They focus so many pastors or church leaders or even well-meaning people, right? They focus on the doing. What can they do, rather than actually just being with the brokenhearted,
Yeah.
right? Because they don't want to feel futility and I don't want to confront an abuser. I don't want to have a difficult conversation with a man. Like, well, let's just make it about you.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. Exactly.
it remi- it reminds me of one story. A woman shared that they were teenagers, going to the lake in the summer, and they would be made to wear these full bathing suits, modesty swimsuits,
Mhm.
turtleneck, full. And her father's friend would come with them, and he pulled the dad aside and said, "Thank you so much for making your daughters wear these swimsuits, so I don't have to struggle with lust when I come to the lake. I can always just, count on not struggling with lust when I come to the lake with your family." And she was applauded for protecting her brother in Christ. But, like, that's where the story ended. And when you look back and see how, wait a minute, you have a potential predator
Yeah.
in your, like, with your family, who's admitting to consuming teenage girls, and wanting to consume them. And
Yeah.
yet somehow the problem is forgiveness. Somehow the problem is like you're focusing on these young girls that just have bodies,
Yeah. Yeah.
rather than like a guy admitting to consuming your daughters.
Yep.
We have fallen so
It's
far.
insane. I
It's
remember
wild.
yeah. There was a situation in the little private school that my kids go to where the girls were told in their gym class they were actually wearing the shorts that were given to them by the school, but, apparently they were too short, I guess, on a couple of girls, and the gym teacher told them, "There is a gentleman who, that works in the school," who they told them who it was, who is having a hard time being stumbled by
Mm,
your shorts. Well, when
mm,
my daughter came home and told me about that, I have 2 daughters. When they came home and told me about that, I said, "Stay away from that guy. That guy
exactly.
is a predator." And
Yep.
basically, she was telling you but thinking that it's your fault, so her thinking is also screwed up, but she's
Correct.
basically telling you, letting you know who's a predator in your school, and you're the
Yes.
one that needs to look out for him, not the other way around.
Bingo.
Yeah,
Exactly.
gross.
And so there's so many of these, I believe I deal with it in chapter 7 of the book Safe Church, but problematic theologies and problematic teachings, right? Submission, headship, authority, grace and forgiveness, modesty, purity, and marriage and divorce are some of the categories that I address. But all these, unfortunately, all these problematic theologies comes from problematic biblical texts that people are misinterpreting
Yeah.
and completely screwing up. But I agree with author Kevin Garcia, who says bad theology kills.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's killing women.
Well, and that is the hard part about it, is that it's because they're taking scripture, then they're arguing that scripture teaches these horrible things, which is not true.
And God.
Yeah, exactly. Like God's
Right.
condoning. Okay, so that's the church leaders. They've got their role to play. But what about the people in the pews? How can just everyday churchgoers foster a culture of safety and accountability in their church?
Yeah. Well, one, we got to start the conversation, right? So let's
That's
just
what you're doing right now.
We got to start talking about it.
Yeah.
How many sermons have you heard about domestic violence?
Yeah. No.
Right. So one out of four women are suffering from domestic violence. What about sexual abuse? 1 out of 3 women will experience sexual abuse. What is the conversation? And if your church is not open to having these hard conversations and talking about these difficult topics, no, that's not a good place.
Yeah.
Right. We got to start using trusted, researched resources, right? There's so much bad resources out there that aren't helpful, that have led generation, I think, in the wrong direction. We've got to find good, trusted resources. And you got to find your tribe. If you can't find it locally, obviously you can find it online, with your group, other groups, like people that are actually having these conversations. And then finally, I would argue it's time to trust your gut, hold on to your power, and trust your own body. God lives in your body. Your intuition as a woman has been attacked and annihilated and objectified. And thus, many times turning on your own body that something's wrong with you. And I would argue the exact opposite. God lives in your body. Trust your body and trust your gut in your intuition. And that's how we can begin to change this terrible trajectory that the church is going in.
Yes, I love that. Thank you so much for being willing to come on the Flying Free podcast and share your new book with us. It's always great to have you on here. Is there anything else that you'd like to offer? Why don't you let people know where they can get your book and also where they can find your work online?
For sure. Yeah. Anywhere books are sold, that small boutique, Amazon has it as well. Little small boutique store, but you can get it anywhere you'd like. Safe Church, How to Guard Against Sexism and Abuse. And then, if you want to find my work at www.christiancc.org. We run workshops all the time, co-ed groups as well for men and women who want to deal with engendered, issues of trauma and abuse. Women who've been abused, men who've abused, put them together in a room, stare at each other 6 inches apart all weekend, and address our deepest heartache.
Wow.
So it's a lot of fun.
Okay, what does Christian CC mean?
So my wife and I run the Christian Counseling Center for sexual health and trauma.
Okay, so that helps in people's brains to remember what what that means. Christian Counseling Center. Okay.
Yes, for sexual health and trauma.
Okay.
Exactly. And I work, focus much of my work on men, helping them outgrow destructive behaviors so that they can live courageous lives.
Yes. And we've had Andrew on the podcast in the past a few times, and we've also had his wife, Christy Bauman, on the podcast as well. So we will put links to those episodes if any of you want to dive further into other works that they've done. So they've been working hard at helping pass this story along in different ways and from different angles for a long time. So thanks again, Andrew.
Great to be with you.
Here.
Thank you.